So here we are getting ready for the real summer to begin. And guest today in studios, my brother Ted Tagami, and I know that violates all of the tenets of the Fourth Estate by actually inviting a sibling onto the show, but this is a blog and podcast, so we can violate those rules. So in studio, my brother Ted Tagami. Ted, how are you?
I'm here.
He's made it.
I was hoping it'd be audio, not video. I'm obviously dressed for the occasion.
Well, we both wore our shorts today because it is summertime.
Yeah.
And, we've been talking about how things have gotten a little hectic. In fact, my normal co-host, Charles Johnson, would say it's hella hectic. And so with that, Charles is actually celebrating today Tupac Day in Oakland with blunts and more. And they're doing a little fundraiser and doing a simulcast with a bunch of rap artists in town. So
is that with the hologram?
you know what? Good point. I don't know. So we'll have to get the answer to that. We're going to try to only stick to what we know.
And I'm not a hologram. I'm actually here.
You're actually here, and me too. I'm actually here. But one of the things that we're finding right now that's happening, and you're very involved with your company, Magnitude IO, in providing STEM education to California students and students in other states as well.
Around the world. Right?
Around the world. So how is remote learning going? What are you seeing from your vantage point? And what do we need to do to make this work in the age of COVID?
Wow. Well, that's an opening. I guess we can look at COVID, but I think probably the best way to look at it is analogous to a tsunami. When that tide recedes off the beach and you just see this huge expanse of beach and the fish start flipping around, it's coming. And we saw it coming. China, Europe, Italy, right? Here it comes. What's our response? Higher ground, right? Are we going to do that? No, it's okay. It's coming. It's slow motion. It's crashing on our shores right now. And second wave, it's still the first wave. We did that thing about just trying to keep the pressure down so the hospitals weren't overwhelmed. New York obviously got just swamped. And bless their souls for being on the front line doing what they did.
So you're saying that the tsunami, you're saying the oceans received, we saw the first wave, and now what's left in its wake is basically broken infrastructure.
It's equity, if we want to just really focus and tie that back to what's happened with the protests and what have you. There's inequities. And what's made it even more demonstrable, I think, was that we've been sheltered in place for months. I mean, I sent all my employees home on March 10th. And so I've pretty much been working out of my garage, trying to run an international education business, from the basement. But it works, right? And so what are some of the challenges here as we start thinking about, when you talk about distance learning or remote learning, those phrases actually rub me really much the wrong way. I really don't, if I'm an educator or if I'm a student, do I really want to be remote? Do I really want to be distant? So we've rephrased the conversation around distributed learning. We think about distributed infrastructure or distributed computing. It's all together, it's all connected, and there's purpose and there's reason behind it. But once you start adding things like remote or distance, you've got these big things you've got to overcome. So you've got these apparent inequities now where districts have sent their teachers got to stay at home, students got to work from home, and anecdotally, I won't call out any districts particularly, but a good percentage of teachers they were lucky if they got 30% of their students online.
So you're talking about the digital divide.
Oh, yeah.
The haves and have-nots.
That's the flotsam and jetsam from the tsunami of the pandemic.
Not only the equipment, but the connectivity.
Right. And then just to add a layer on top of that, it's understanding the practice of distributed learning as an educator that might, for 3 decades, have never taught that way and still needs help checking their email.
So some 23,000 students, and that's a rough number, here in Oakland Unified School District, as an example, rely on the school to provide them breakfast and lunch.
Right.
And so, not knowing, and I wouldn't presume to know, where dinner's coming from, we would presume, and I would really say presume, that these students are getting most of their nutrition from those 2 meals provided by school. So when the schools shut down, the question was, how are these students going to have access to food? Mm-hmm. Now we're going beyond that and saying, besides nutrition, Now we're talking about access to their actual education. And does distant learning work, yes or no? Our experiment in our household is a little bit of a challenge for one of our children more than the other. Now the question is, how is that played out on a much larger scale? And I think what you're saying is it's demonstrated not only the inequity, if you will, but also now a whole host of new issues, even for educators.
Well, that's right. Yeah. And so digital learning is an important component, but a lot of the work we do is project-based experiences. Your hands are involved in it. You're getting data from phenomena that you can experience. For example, we typically, during a regular school year, work with middle school and high school students to design and build a payload. In fact, my nephew, your son, did that years ago in middle school, where they constructed and understood atmospheric instruments and then launched a high-altitude balloon on the Oakland waterfront. Went up to 100,000 feet and traveled south down towards Santa Cruz. And we had a camera board, and they had imaging and what have you, but the students had to contact the Federal Aviation Administration and file a notice to airmen because we're flying through airspace.
A notice to
airmen. Yeah.
Notice to airmen, got it. So telling pilots that there was this rogue balloon from the East Bay School for Boys.
Exactly. Through Oakland and San Francisco and San Jose airspace, and so they need to know that. There's not a lot of airplanes in the sky now, so we just still need to do that. But now under a distance learning, a distributed learning environment, you can't really do that project-based experience, so what do? So you have to start now reinventing what you've done and think about a way where it can resonate with the learner. And fundamentally, if we look to the international standards for technology, ISTE standards, what I really like about those standards as an example of directions to head in is they're looking more about how to provide agency for the learner or give you tools to learn how to learn digitally. How are you a good digital citizen? How can you communicate effectively? How do you do your research and know fact from fiction? These are very powerful skills to have. And so we can think about learning your times tables or how to read and write and what have you. These are fundamental, numeracy and literacy is foundation. But when we get into knowing facts and dates, might be good on a trivia quiz, but how will it really help you if you don't understand the context of that date? If we understand equality and we look at voting rights and what have you, if we understand the context we're in today, we might know the date, we might know what was passed, but what is the ramifications? How does society change from that? And so if we can get learners to understand how to learn, how to get agency for themselves, then we have an empowered community. And so really what Magnitude is trying to do is to empower the next generation. It's out of my own self-interest. When I'm old and senile, rocking on the porch at 93, I hope that the world is taking care of itself, and we didn't screw it up even more. And so I think it's a chance to do that. And so that's what we're kind of up to. And there's a lot of different things we're facing as a society. That's just one of them.
So locally, here in Oakland and clearly the county, and then with that, the state of California is all right now in the midst of looking at budget, right? So the state's setting budget priorities, evaluating what it's going to need to do to tighten its belt. We have a changed economy, and currently, some people would say, looking at the stock market, you wouldn't know that over 100,000 people have died, or that the more people are out of work than had been in our lifetimes, or that unemployment was going to run out in July, and the list goes on. But long story short, state has some tough budget decisions to make.
There's a deficit.
What priorities would you say, if people are going to say this is the new normal, and distant learning, and I'm sorry to use the term again, is going to be the pathway forward because there's no cure for COVID right now. How do you think the state should approach this, the Department of Education, and what monies need to be allocated in what areas to help address this problem that you're seeing?
Well, it's interesting. I would say the plurality of school districts right now, whether it's a regional, at the county, or even at the state level, they're looking at kind of three models that they're going to open up again. And I think one thing is everyone's trying to still play out the scenario. And you just got to make a call. Whether you're right or wrong, you just got to make a call. And I would personal choice, is err on the side of caution.
Not open to schools.
Be really cognizant that some households are going to need some kind of community support. You were talking about food pickups and things like that. You've got a dual working household. You've got younger children, what have you. They're going to need some kind of care. Our society's been built up around that for generations. It's hard to just shut that off. But do all students need to be in school? I don't know. So anyway, school's back in session again is one scenario. The scenario is, hey, you know what? Your kitchen table is your classroom. Right? That's what you're going to be doing. That's what you're going to work on. And what kind of compensation are parents getting? If I want to be like, you're asking me to be a teacher, so where do you send the check? Here's my address. Or the hybrid model, where they've got their alternate days and what have you. But in all those equations, you got to look at costs. You got to look at unions and union contracts. And I'm way in deep water here. It's outside my wheelhouse. I try to not get too. You know much more about the machinations of politics than I do.
Or know that I don't know.
There you go. Yeah,
And we can both agree.
I can
Let's
guess.
both agree that for the purpose of this discussion today and this topic, we'll both say to be continued on that
Right.
topic
Yeah,
because it's a
please
good
weigh
one.
in. Yeah.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
No, I'll venture a little bit further, but I want to go back. So we're setting some priorities. So we have three models,
Yep.
and open the schools. The question is, what's the protocol to say that you've been tested
Right.
to go back to school?
Right.
What are the protocols so there's safe management once you approach the school each and every day?
Right.
And what are the best practices once you're there?
Right.
So is that classroom and that class size now an expanded social bubble, separate and apart from the fact that those, let's say, 32 students are also then having interaction with family members who also then have social bubbles? And how are you tracking who had contact with whom
Right.
if someone then becomes infected?
Yeah, this is interesting. It's very profound. If you look at the cost of schools.
That's
and
the first scenario we talked about.
Right. So opening the schools up again. If you look at, I'll pick a medium-sized school district in the state of California, 30,000 students. They're looking right now at an estimated shortfall from budget from the state of $30 million. Okay? Now they have to also do some calculations on PPE for their staff and cleaning. Their estimate, again, this is just back of the napkin, kind of
Yep.
early preliminary numbers.
I'm getting a calculator. while you do
$6.5 to
that.
$7 million for PPE for the next school year. And that's basically money you're throwing in the garbage at the end of every day, your gloves and your masks, because that's it, you can't use them anymore. Well, and how about that third grade that, whoops, I left it at home or whatever, right? You need the emergency supply, right? And good luck on having those second graders stop from hugging each other, right? Because, hey, it's good to see you, right? And that's what they want to do, and which is great.
So now we're
But we can't
racing
do it.
towards herd immunity conversations.
Exactly, and so you have to put that in the equation, but the cost factor. Now, on top of this is something I didn't even think about. If you have a district that does any type of busing, and you've got now the 6-foot distance or more between the passengers, so this one school district, I'm using it as example, 30,000 students, is going to, they estimate, need 4 times the number of buses.
Huge carbon impact.
That, fuel costs, labor costs, where are they going to find the drivers?
So let's go back in and ask the question in the context, building on this. So the current average daily attendance allocation of funds
$8,000 plus or minus in the state of California.
per what?
Per student, per annum.
Per annum. And so this is in essence $1,000 per student, as you said, $30 million shortfall for 30,000 students. Average, right? So you're saying that school district is short that dollar amount.
Yeah.
So it's $1,000 per student short.
So you can just take it across the state of California, right, and look at it that way. So current state population of California, about a third of that is going to be students.
So let's call it 42 million.
So say 12, 15 million, third of that in each grade band. I could give you numbers if we really want to look it up, but and so that's your shortfall. About 12%, I guess maybe off
Yep.
the top. Yeah, so the numbers are not going to be my strong suit thinking about this, but the ramifications. So let's look at the psychology of this as well. So you're 6 years old, and you're learning your social norms with masks on, and you can't touch your friend. What are we imprinting with our youth, and what's going to happen when they're 8, 10, 12, 15 years
Well,
of age?
it might be survival by way of where we are currently in the world of pandemic.
Yeah.
And then the question would be, what can we draw on from the past? How well was history documented for the pandemic of 1912, what was learned from that, and certainly skimmed over in school, I would say that for sure. Some of us have probably done more reading about the past in the last few weeks than ever before. Not to go off topic here, but you mentioned briefly where we are in the world of, with what's happened with George Floyd, with Black Lives Matter.
Right.
And I just got through watching with my children The American Idealist. And it's something that I've used for some of our interns who really didn't have a context of the Great Society, of what we were dealing with in this country after John Kennedy was assassinated and after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And in essence, an effort by Lyndon Johnson to basically have a war on poverty. And the war on poverty really got bushwhacked, if you will, with the war in Vietnam. And some Southern senators who really wanted to fuel that fire and defund things like community action, like Head Start, like Vista, like legal services for the poor, like OEO and community action, because it was feeling that by empowering communities, by providing them legal services and a path to empower themselves and help set priorities of what they needed, like things of creating an even playing field, improving the quality of schools, addressing issues like police brutality. They were in essence punished by the U.S. Senate and defunded. And the war went to feed, the money went to feed the war in Vietnam. Right. And so we went from a war on poverty to a war on crime, which really became the war on drugs, which really became the new Jim Crow. And that is a whole nother podcast. So coming back to California, the state budget, education, the challenges of distant learning, and talking about the first model of opening up the classroom, we see consequences intended and unintended there and issues that need to be addressed. The second model that was being discussed was to say keep the schools closed and then find a way to provide the tools that still have a big cost for people then to plug in and have access through technology to be able to learn with the understanding that there's an equipment distribution issue that has to be addressed, as well as an internet connectivity issue that needs to be addressed.
And laws as well.
Okay.
Right, equity. There's equity laws, equal access to education.
Right.
Right. And now, if you have a student with special needs,
Right.
well, how are you going to do that? There might be equipment at a facility at a school that can manage that learner's requirements, whatever impairment they might have, and home may not have that. And Zoom ain't going to cut it.
Right.
It's not going to cut it.
So all the aspects of the American Disabilities Act, as well as I'm sure there's a lot of specifics when it comes to education that have to be addressed.
Now, so that roughly $8,000 per student per annum in the state of California, there's additional funds that are available under local control funding formulas. So if you're an English language learner, the district gets extra money per diem. If you're, this is attendance, right? So you got to have your butt in the seat or you don't get money. So another thing's how you counting attendance with the distance learner, right? Again, on the best classrooms, at least in the spring here, 1/3 of the students were showing up. How are you going to take attendance? How do you evaluate?
1/3 of the students were
in a good scenario, right?
With distant learning.
Yes, yeah, distributed. Well, it's distance right now. I want to make it distributed, right? That's part of the problem.
Okay, so so I just want to clarify. This is an important point. You're saying instead of the term distant learning, you're saying distributed learning. Right,
and that's not a phrase that I don't think you're going to hear much from. It's kind of something we're adopting and what we believe in.
So define it. We could can that and say, what does that mean? What does distributed learning mean?
Well, let's just look at root meanings of words, right? So think about distance, and we're kind of at a distance right now, right? Or think about remote.
We get a tape measure out. I think it's actually 8 feet.
Well, okay, well, it's more than 6 for sure.
Yeah, but I spit farther than that. So but go ahead.
Maybe I shit back another 2 more feet.
Exactly right.
And if I'm in the other room there, right, I might be remote learning, right?
Okay, I'm ready. All right, so
you can have your N95 going.
So tell me about.
But distributed.
Yes.
Is really, it's a sense that the conversation's happening in many different places. And part of it is more of a pedagogical approach to learning. We're in these frameworks, and it's a little radical here, especially when you look at public schools and the way systems work. But I think back to what a superintendent's needs are right now, they have facilities. and they have infrastructure facilities, they want to make sure those facilities are open. Because it's costing money every day. You're in real estate, you understand this if through every fiber of your being, that if your doors aren't open, then you're suffering. And that's basically, in essence, what's happening with these facilities. So, just kind of jumping out a couple decades, what does a school campus look like? Do they need that kind of infrastructure? There might be some campuses in an urban core, whether it's in New York, Boston, Atlanta, here in Oakland, whatever, that's prime property and could be redeveloped into something much more than a turn of the 20th century playground with old steel equipment that the kids can't even play on because of COVID-19.
Right, or it doesn't meet a safety standard. I mean, there was a series of TED Talks, and I'm going to be embarrassed not being able to recall Ken's last name who gave these talks, but they're probably some of the more watched TED Talks, where he talks about a 19th century model of batch learning, educating with a born-on date, kind of the one-size-fits-all.
That's right. And it goes back to the colonists.
Ken Robinson,
that's right,
maybe is his name? And
Sir Ken Robinson.
Thank you, Sir Ken Robinson. And it's one of the great challenges is basically saying, now a George Carlin riff, right? Smart enough to run the machines and do the accounting, right?
Well, yeah, that I think it's that or another lecture conversation he had, and he described it as the English Empire. Their school systems, which were mostly adopted here and still, I think, exist in certain forms, were really designed for consistency. If you had a diplomat in a faraway land, you wanted to make sure that systems were operated properly, they were communicating the right way. They had a basic foundational knowledge. They understood the gears and the levers that were required to make the empire work.
There you go.
Right? It was a massive empire.
I have a copy upstairs of Molworth's Pocket Guide, which was given to all British officers, grade lieutenant or above, which has all the math in it required to build bridges, handle communications, and basic fortifications.
What year is this?
It's from the late 1800s.
Oh, I've never seen
this.
And it's
leather bound. It's upstairs, and it was basically something that you could fit in your back pocket.
I love that stuff.
And if you needed to build a rail bridge or needed to build a fortification or something, the math was in there for you to do all your basic engineering to get that built.
One of the
That's standardized for all grade lieutenants or better in the British Army.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Totally off topic. One of the funnest things at a garage sale is finding those old engineering books where they got all the tables in there or the tools.
Hello.
Right? Grandpa's basement. Those don't exist anymore.
AISC steel standards from the turn of the century. I have one of those books.
Right.
Though we don't
Fold-out map with the charts on it.
Hello. That's exactly right.
That's awesome.
Right. Real math. Get your number 2 pencil out. So we have this other challenge with these facilities and repurposing facilities, and what are the costs to maintain roofs, keep air conditioning running so the system doesn't foul,
or even upgrade the system because it's inefficient.
or just address the fact that if you're going to shutter a building, there's still a cost to it.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's still a piece of real estate in the neighborhood. What's the upkeep? How do you address issues with safety and security? What are the responsible things you do if you're the district to minimize liability or exposure? So there's that. So the third thing that you talked about in regards to choices. So there was open the schools. There's don't open the schools and looking for distributed learning. Still dealing with these other issues. What's the third one? Recapture that for us.
So that's just the hybrid of these, and there's going to be sliding. It's like, well, we really don't want to open the schools in its entirety, but there's assets there that are important, right? And we really can't keep everyone at home, right? But at home, there's a reason why you want to do that from a safety perspective. And so what does middle ground look like? And that, I think, is where the conversation is right now. People are grappling with this as we're having this conversation. So I don't think there's any remedy that's out there that's like, this is the fix or solution. But probably more profound than that, Phil, I think, is understanding that whatever people decide to do, open the school, close the school, do some kind of hybrid model, they must, super important to understand that all that flotsam and jetsam is not going to go away just in 6 months. It's like Fukushima, you got radiation, you shut the place down. Right? So what does the 5-year plan look like? What's the 25-year plan look like? That 6-year-old young woman, when she's in college or in the workforce, over the next 15 years or so, what's her experience going to be?
It's interesting. Fukushima, here you have, people say clean and efficient nuclear power, but for Fukushima, but for 3 Mile Island, but for Chernobyl. And then you stop and say, okay, Japan decides we're going to get out of nuclear power. We're going to go to...
I gave you a good stand there. Nice transition.
Well, we're going to go to coal-fired power plants, but not the 1957 Chevy like you have in Utah, Nevada, or Colorado.
Right, yeah.
We want a Prius.
Yeah.
And we want coal gasification, and we want something that still meets the emissions requirements of the Paris Climate Summit to be COP21 compliant.
Right.
And then you have to stop and say, well, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And you realize, oh, that's achievable,
Right.
still not ideal.
I'd say as a layperson, the best example you give is a Prius.
Yeah.
Because it's looking at the solution where you combine the two, so gasification of coal is starting to move in that direction. You can't, well, I guess you could
We
say...
still have a country full of 1957 Chevys, though. I want to emphasize that point.
Wow.
So the Clean Air Act, though basically changing standards and moving the energy industry away from lower rank forms of coal, I would say globally in the world, we still see lignite used, heavily mined in Germany and Africa and China, brown coal basically,
Right,
Indonesian coal,
Right.
just lower rank forms of coal instead of a more efficient, higher BTU, lower sulfur, lower NOx, lower emissions
And
coal.
filter systems and other things like that, advanced
Scrubbers,
technologies.
and then exactly how you're going to
Real
capture
science.
what blending is going on to make this as efficient, and then it's still transitioning. Because ultimately, if you say, where's the future? Yeah, you want sustainable energy. Who doesn't?
Energy is an amazing conversation.
And it's an important one. And again, we go back to capture. So wind is intermittent, the sun is intermittent, power and baseload demand is constant.
Right.
And we need to have that baseload demand. What is the
Sometimes
most
that changes though too, right? Oh, you say base load, so that is...
Yeah, what is the most responsible way to get baseload demand?
Right.
So when you flip that switch, it's available when you want it.
Yeah, so wherever the power is being generated, whatever source, there was something very interesting that went beyond battery storage that I just found out about. It was super simple technology. And it's actually connected to what you do, it's rail. So what they did is, 2,000 tons, I think was the amount, of mass on a rail car that was surplus power on the grid. They had to put it somewhere. Instead of putting it into batteries, they put it into the motors of the rail car, and it went up an incline.
And then they utilized it on its way down.
You got it right. And
So
they
they
released it when they
recaptured
needed
it.
it, right? And so it was like, I forget the math on it, but it was a really nice ROI. And there's it doesn't matter what your source is. If you don't have peak demands in your plant, you've got surplus power, store it somewhere.
Right.
Batteries, at a certain point, you got to replace your batteries. Those rail cars are going to last a
So
long
these
time.
could be very large amusement park rides.
Very slow.
Hello.
Very slow. Because it's just
Ted
a very
Tagami in the
large
house,
ride.
people. So Ted, look, for our show today, as we kind of wrap it up, Magnitude.io. Tell me about the website. How do people want to know more about Magnitude? Where do they go?
Right. Well, whether you're at-home parent looking for something to do with your students, whether you're an educator,
Your children and your students.
yeah, well, yeah,
'Cause now you're a teacher.
You're a teacher now, and
We
they've
were
got,
before, hopefully.
yeah, and yeah, there's a challenge. I think if you're working at home as a parent, a lot of them are having now go back to work. With a younger child, it's going to be different than with an older student. They can be more self-directed.
So the website is
Magnitude.io, right? And really, we're creating extraordinary experiences. And what was really a challenge for us back in mid-March is to retool our thinking, adapt what we had already done for that distributed learning concept. And so we run projects in orbit aboard the International Space Station, as you know. We've completed 7 missions already on the station. We get rides on a SpaceX Dragon or on a Northrop Grumman Atlas rocket to get up there. Our 8th mission, we actually delayed twice. We moved it to February next year.
if we're not careful, they're going to put our podcast on that next rocket.
They could. I could fit it on there. I just
you
put it
go.
on one of those little SD cards.
There you go. One of those mini SD cards to drive
Put a
the
lot of
show.
podcasts on there. Exactly right. And so what we've done in retooling this is for our spring program, where teachers were really trying to manage pedagogically the expectations that were placed upon them for state testing and making sure by the end of the term that the students had these basic understandings. We said, you know what? let's just rewind. I mean, rewind significantly. How many learning experiences did we have at our father's shop on a Saturday morning, right? Clean the tools or do this or that, or what's this thing? Now it's kind of hard. The apprenticeship programs are something that's hard to get back, but what we wanted to do is basically have something where the students had something that was physical, that they could study a phenomenon. Our projects that we run in space, we're actually growing plants. We're looking at plant biology and microgravity. And there's a reason for it. I'll talk about the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. It's kind of, but the bottom line is, we just wanted a student to grow a plant, in this case a legume, because legumes are a source not only of nitrogen in the soil with rhizobia bacteria, right? But they're also amazing protein sources, an alternative to animal meat. And so there's an interesting possibility here if we start looking at what we can do to leverage our crops for optimum production. And I'll just end with this real concern I have, and magnitude, really, we're trying to change the world, not incrementally, but orders of magnitude. I think there's a profound opportunity with 8 billion people on the planet. If we're getting all those cylinders firing with their intelligences to solve problems, we'd have a much different planet. And right now, a lot of them are being disenfranchised or not even communicated with. And those opportunities, whether it's in Appalachia or in North Africa, there's challenges to be met. And we're looking to meet those head on, doing things like that. And we've got a balloon we launched that's heading around the world. It's supposed to be somewhere over north of Hawaii here in just a couple hours.
What's the balloon called?
So that's it's running in. It's called a Sky Tracker, and it's traveling about 45,000 feet. So we're in the stratosphere. Average speed around 100 miles an hour.
Last I checked, you were over Africa.
Yes.
Heading towards the Middle East.
Yes, and so we went through the Middle East.
All the way
it went
past
through
the Middle
China. We got our last signal before it went into the Pacific was coming into Japan's airspace at sunset in Japan. We actually flew right over Pyongyang, right over North Korea. And so you can track it.
And there was no missile launch.
Well, yeah. It's a 16-gram payload.
16 grams.
Yeah, so you talk a couple ounces, and it's a NASA engineer, Bill Brown, is the inventor. We just apply the learning experience. It's little solar panels, a ham radio operator. Amateur radio is what we're operating on a frequency. You just need a license. And what's great for, if there are any young folks that tune into your message, what's nice about amateur radio is disaster recovery and emergency response.
So there's a lesson there for all of us.
No age restriction on getting your amateur radio license. So you got the call letters of your favorite radio station.
Sure.
You can get your own call letters
So
too.
we invoked the Jodie Foster character in the movie Contact.
That's right. Man.
And the relationship her and her father had with trying to reach extraterrestrials.
There you go.
Right.
Yeah, let's just try to reach each other right now.
Right. Well, I mean, that's a different form of the SETI project, right? So, no, Ted, I appreciate you coming on, and I would encourage everyone to check out Magnitude.io. And we're going to have you back, but what we're going to do is we're going to find a victim who has to sit between the two Tagami brothers as we go back and forth on whatever topic we choose next.
Oh,
Maybe we'll get Mom to do it.
Yeah, you get Liz. And I don't know if the internet will break.
That will break the internet.
Yeah,
We'll
it'll be
bring
a
our
pretty
sister.
awesome show, though.
We'll have to include a little discussion about olive oil, maybe, and raising chickens.
That's right.
Okay. Well, thank you for
listen.
coming.
Well, thanks for